So today we have Professor Willet Kempton with us today. Willet, how are you doing?
Great, thanks.
Wonderful.
Thanks for inviting me, Dustin.
I appreciate you taking the time. So to get things started off, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why offshore wind potential should be on the topic of everybody's mind right now?
Okay, my name is Willet Kempton. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I've been doing research in offshore wind since about 2000 and research in energy since 1975 or something like that. I am primarily doing research now. I've developed and taught multiple courses at the university, but I'm focused primarily on research now and supervising grad students, occasional guest lectures. Well, the reason offshore wind should be on our mind, not everyone's mind, because it's a regional resource. It's along the coasts, obviously. That doesn't mean you can't have power lines running in, but the states that have coastal areas are most likely to benefit and most involved in developing it. So the reason offshore wind should be on our mind is because over the last 3 or 4 years, it's gotten much less expensive as a source of electricity because it's a really, really large resource, which means if you care about environmental issues, that means you can quickly reduce the pollution that causes health impacts, and you can quickly reduce CO2 emissions. It's being used, it's being committed, it has been committed to by all the states in our region from Virginia to Massachusetts, but not Delaware. So when you put up a map of all the states that are doing offshore wind deals, there's this weird blank area in the middle, which is called the state of Delaware. So that doesn't mean we should be doing it, but it's just that all these other state governments are making decisions which for some reason Delaware is not. And I think that may be partly our history. We were sort of first with a contract to buy offshore wind, and then the developer the state approved that, but the developer never built it. So I think there's a little bit of a hangover from that, but we've really passed that time now. It's now at the point where it's pretty much the same cost as conventional energy, and it can be actually built faster and doesn't require state subsidy. So why are we not doing that is kind of, I guess, I'd say the question is not so much why we should be doing it, but why the heck aren't we doing it now? So I'm sure there'll be more questions about that, but just to give an overall perspective, the state of Delaware on average uses 1.2 gigawatts of electricity. That's 1,200 megawatts of electricity. So this sort of amount of energy that you can produce from one cost-effective offshore wind is about half that. So literally with one project, you could halve the fossil fuel burden of generating electricity for the state of Delaware. So that's the reason we should be thinking about it here.
So what's the current percentage of power that Delmarva gets from wind energy now?
Well, Delmarva Power gets now, or that is last I have tabulated from them, which is through the middle of 2019, all renewables together are 5.7%. Of that, wind is about half. And then you've got a miscellaneous other things, wood, biomass, solar, hydro, and so forth.
Do you know about where those wind projects are mostly located right now?
Well, they're not. There's one wind project in the state of Delaware, and that's our turbine on the Lewis campus. There's a few very small turbines, sort of backyard turbines, but that's the only one that's sort of, industrial scale, which also means cost effective. That runs the entire Lewis campus, that one turbine, with a bunch left over to sell to the city of Lewis. So that runs our ship operations, all our labs, all our offices, conference center, and then there's extra left over to sell to the city of Lewis. So that's one turbine. All the rest are outside of the state. So Delmarva contracts with wind power from whoever's lowest cost, and theoretically it goes through the power lines to get in to serve Delmarva customers. But in fact, it's serving local needs. So it's good to sponsor wind projects in other states, which is basically what they're doing when they do that. But a offshore wind, you're actually building the generation, or a company that you're contracting with. The wires go right into the state, and you're both buying it. So contractually, you're getting that wind power, and also it's actual running through the lines. So it mostly goes into our state. So long answer, but it's almost all out of state.
Right. So a number of states I've seen in news articles and certainly in Virginia, Maryland, and some New England states, they're all kind of ramping up their wind energy efforts. So what's really the mechanism they're using to do that without spending, millions of dollars on these projects? Or are they spending millions of dollars?
They're not. Okay, so it's the coastal states. You said a lot of states in the area, and they are in the area, but just to be clear, coastal states are developing offshore wind, and then lots of inland states are developing land-based wind. In both cases, it's similar policy mechanism. They are contracting for power. So the state isn't buying the wind farm. The state is telling their utilities, you have to contract for power, or you can't be in business as a utility, you have to buy power. And we're telling you that either some fraction of that has to be renewable energy, or in the case of wind and solar, there's sometimes it makes sense to say, we want you to have X amount solar, or we want you to have X amount offshore wind. So it's simply a requirement on the utilities. Now, because utilities are a highly regulated industry, especially electric utilities, they still have to show that it's cost effective. So there's a cost effectiveness step there. But the basic policy mechanism is you just have a law that says you utilities need to contract for X amount of offshore wind power by Y year. Say it's about a 3 to 4 year development process. So if the state of Delaware were doing this, say at the end of the year, calendar year now, it would probably be for coming online 2024, 2025.
So so it's essentially in the solar industry, you have, power purchase agreements where you're not buying the panels, but you're utilizing the energy and then the rest kind of goes into the grid. Is a similar situation, I suppose?
It's exactly the same type of contract, but instead of you as an individual putting them on your roof and paying for power, it's the utilities, in our state, Delmarva Power, maybe some of the others, but Delmarva's 80% of the electricity in the state of Delaware. So it would be Delmarva Power having a power purchase agreement with a developer of the wind farm. The developer of the wind farm puts in a little bit of money, and then they find an investor who will loan. These are kind of $3 billion projects. It's a big chunk at once, like I said. So they find an investor that would loan $3 billion at a rate that everybody agrees is reasonable. And then the thing gets built, and when the kilowatt hours start flowing, then Delmarva Power buys them at a wholesale rate and sells them to all of us at a retail rate.
So what would that, we spoke a little bit about the potential for wind energy in Delaware in terms of meeting our needs. If we did a large scale investment in wind, what would be the potential economic impact, both positive in terms of, or negative in terms of employment, but also in terms of rates?
Okay, so just to take your wording, we wouldn't invest. A developer and an investor would invest.
Right.
We would just say you have to do a contract. So it has been true until about 2 or 3 years ago. Those are always higher cost electricity. So whenever you did that, you know that the ratepayers, all of us who use electricity, and industries and stores that use electricity, they would be paying a bit more for electricity. That's no longer true. If you get the contract right, and you put some requirements on it, like I said, there's a second review. In our case, it's by the Public Service Commission, the PSC. If you get the contract right, you can have it be under the cost of electricity. So Massachusetts has done that successfully. Some of the other states have been willing to pay more because they had other goals, like more jobs or whatever, more economic development. But there's a reduction in cost potentially, or maybe there's some reason it doesn't work out that way and it's a little bit more. So that's an economic impact, either higher or lower costs. And as you say, there's employment. So to have a wind farm, you've got to have maintenance. You've got to have a maintenance port infrastructure. That's maybe a much smaller investment, maybe 10 million or something. Maybe you can use an existing harbor. We don't really have a good harbor for this sort of ready to go, so there'd probably be a harbor built, again, probably by the developer or by a maintenance company. That's maybe 30 sort of full-time equivalent jobs over a 20-year period. So that's actually a lot of person years of employment. And then you've got all the secondary industries that feed that, food services and clothing and personal protection equipment. It's a different kind of PPE than we're talking about these days, but prevent you from falls, prevent you from heavy stuff hitting your, toes, prevent you from drowning if you go in the water. So there's all these supplementary things to that. So that's just the maintenance. That has to be done, and it has to be nearby. That would probably be in Delaware. And then there's opportunities for ports. So the Delaware Bay is a great place for ports to support construction of offshore wind. So I think it's pretty certain there'll be either a port on the New Jersey side or the Delaware side as we start to have these other wind farms built, whether or not there's one in Delaware. If there's a whether or not there's a contract in Delaware, a PPA. If there's a PPA in Delaware, we're much more likely to get port infrastructure, maybe manufacturing, things like that. So if we had a contract, then we are seen as cooperative and friendly to the industry, and then we're more likely to get other things.
So I want to take a question from Facebook real quick, and then get to Gary. Had a question here on Zoom. So, and you may be able to answer this or not. How do investors benefit from sponsoring such big projects? What are the criteria for their return on investment? Any ideas on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've worked on that a good bit. So, well, of course, like any investment, you're first looking to make sure that the developer has the capability of doing the project, knows what they're doing, has done it before, haven't messed up. Here you're building something that's actually far more certain than, say, a shopping center or even a power plant that burns fuel, because you have a long-term contract to sell the power, so you know what your revenue is. And yes, the wind fluctuates, but over a 1-year period, it doesn't actually fluctuate that much. So you know approximately how much power you're going to be generating per year, plus or minus a few percent. So the developer, the investor, if they think the developer knows what they're doing and can pull off a project, and if the price is reasonable, and they're going to look at the suppliers, are the suppliers giving them reasonable prices? How much are they really going to build this for? It's just like anything else. Is it a good investment or not? Except the revenue is far more certain here. There's far less risk than most development projects.
Thank you. So Gary asks, who would make the decision about using offshore wind? Is it the state of Delaware? Is it Delmarva Power? If it's the state, how is that done? Like, who would introduce a bill, or what committee would handle it? Do you know any of that?
Sure. Yeah, so we've got two models from the other states that have done this. One is an executive order from the governor. And that's, subject to something from the legislature later. So it's a little bit less certain, perhaps. So getting back to investor risk and stuff, but you can do it very quickly. And what we've seen in several states is that we have an executive order followed by an act by the legislature. In other places, it's been the legislature that's led, and then it would be whatever energy committee in each house, each chamber, would pass a bill. And Delaware has done this. You know, we had HB 6 in 2005, I think it was, that said, it didn't say it had to be offshore wind, but it said it had to be new kind of power that has this and this and the other criteria, including lower CO2 emissions and so forth. But Massachusetts passed a bill first. New York has passed a bill following the governor's executive order. New Jersey passed a bill first. And those bills simply said, our state's utilities by whatever year, 2022, 23, shall issue contracts to buy offshore wind. And, you know, they often have conditions like there has to be a net economic benefit to the state, or the price has to be no higher than, 8 cents per kilowatt hour, things like that. So that way the legislature can ensure that there's not a, there's not going to be some downside that's not recognized at the time the bill is written.
Right. All right. Here we go. What about those that say they don't want to see it, or that these turbines will destroy the tourism economy? Where's the reality lie there?
Well, there's two different statements. So will it destroy the tourism economy? Because offshore wind turbines have been built a lot, you know, including off Block Island, which has a big tourist economy, and in many locations in Europe, we know that doesn't happen. You know, there may be some people who don't go because they say, I liked it better when I just looked out at the ocean and didn't see anything except the occasional ship passing by. But there hasn't been any measurable reduction in visits or tourism. And there's, for Block Island, for example, the charter boat operators love it because they're doing fishing trips out around the turbines because they're hard structure, so there's more recreational fishing. Doesn't necessarily translate to more commercial fishing. And they take people out to see the turbines, which is also very common in Europe. So the second point is just wrong. I mean, you probably could do it in a negative way, like put them 50 feet off the beach or something, but in any kind of real project, we haven't seen that. The first one, I don't want to see them. Well, that's a matter of aesthetics. I can't say that's right or wrong. A person may say they don't want to see them, and that's fine. And maybe they own a beach house, looks right out where the development's going to be. Okay, then the society, or maybe even that person, has to trade off. Is it worth the other things you get for that change in the pristine ocean? So that's a matter of a societal decision and maybe a personal decision of what your ethics are. So, you know, you're talking kind of a wind farm of the size that we're looking at, maybe 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts. You know, you're saving 10 lives a year on average. Of course, there's a big error bar around that. So, you know, is your view, you've seen something in your view when it's clear enough to see 8 miles or plus out, is that really worth 10 or 20 lives a year? I don't think that's a reasonable trade-off, but maybe some would say that. I don't think it's a reasonable trade-off for the state to say, yeah, it doesn't matter. And that's not even talking about climate. We're just talking about pollution now. And they're not all necessarily all fatalities in Delaware. Some power plants are further inland and people die because of pollution near them. So it's just a matter of trade-offs on how your aesthetics trade off against other things. I have a pretty strong feeling about that. And I didn't mention climate change, but to me, that's also a big issue. But yeah, you know, for some people, it's a negative aesthetically. It's no longer a pristine ocean.
So I want to ask and possibly answer some nuances with a question that Peggy just rose about a visual of how much the turbines would show at 18 miles or so offshore. You've sent me visuals before in the past, but one of the issues that a lot of people have in interpreting these visuals is you have to be at such and such distance, depending on how big the printout is that you're viewing. If it's 11 by 17, you need to be this far away. If it's much smaller, you need to be this far away. So how can we get those visuals out, I guess, is the question, in a way that makes sense to people so that they can know that they can't zoom in on their phone to try and see it and that sort of thing? Any ideas?
Well, physical presence, is the way to do it, but that's a little bit harder these days until we get back to mingling more. So you can use kind of, I guess there's sort of three things I'd say on the, it's not as big of an effect as you think. Off Delaware, it's not that clear. 18 miles offshore in the summer, how often do you see stuff that's small 18 miles offshore? So most days you're not going to see it at all. That's on the positive or less impact side. On the more impact side, there are not navigation, but aircraft lights. So at the top, they have these red flashing lights. So if they're just on all the time, all night, then it's pretty visible at night, again, if it's not too misty. So that's a negative. And you can kind of imagine what that would look like. Again, at 18 miles, it's small, and sometimes it'd be obscured by the mist, but you see these blinking lights out there. So there is technology that, turns those on only when there's aircraft in the area, which I would definitely recommend for this. And then the third thing about size, which is really what you asked about, I think an easy way to think about it without a visual is you hold your thumb at arm's length. Even today's largest turbines are not going to be any higher than your thumbnail above the surface. And it's a thin thing. It's much thinner than your thumbnail at arm's length. So it's visible. It's there, on a clear day, that is, it's visible. But it's not like a huge impact on what you see when you look at the ocean.
Gotcha. All right, so we got about 5 minutes. I want to ask one more question that comes up a lot. So how is sea life affected in birds, and how do they kind of mitigate that impact during construction?
Well, during construction, the main risk is to the right whale, which migrates through our area and is very sensitive to sound. Generally, marine mammals' hearing is such that the impact driving of pounding the steel pile into the sea floor can damage hearing of nearby marine mammals. So there's several ways to impact that, and that's part of the environmental assessment. But the kind of simplest thing is you have spotters, and when there's any right whales or other marine mammals in the area, you stop construction. So that's kind of simple. That's what they did at Block Island. It didn't create any problem for the right whales. It did mean they had to stop construction a couple of days. So because that's costly, the developers are motivated to find other solutions to that. And I've actually worked on some with a group that I work with. I directed a whole different way of putting the pilings in and everything. But there are multiple ways to solve that problem. That is the primary environmental problem. Now, also, whenever you put anything up in the air, you have bird fatalities. If it's got windows, they don't see that there's structure there and they run into it. If it's solid during occluded weather like fog or low clouds, they'll run into it because they don't see it. So I remember visiting a wind farm in Pennsylvania. They had no bird fatalities all year. Then they had one day with really low clouds and they had killed 5 birds in that wind farm. So average wind turbine kills 2.6 birds per year. So if we had a wind farm with, 10 turbines, or let's say 50 turbines, then that's 130 birds per year. So it's undesirable. It's a cost that's not so easy to mitigate. But again, you have to compare it with other things. If you look at the equivalent amount of pollution produced for fossil fuel generation to produce the same amount of electricity, it's probably about double that in bird fatalities. But they're not easily measured. Those are estimated because a bird hits a turbine. If it's on land, at least, you can see the bird on the ground. And we've done studies with our turbine in Lewis. But when they're killed by pollution, it's hard to identify what it is. But you're probably about halving bird fatalities by displacing fossil fuel and putting in wind power.
Great. Well, we got a couple minutes left. So is there anything you want to wrap up with as we conclude here today? And again, I really appreciate you joining us on this live stream.
Sure. Well, I would just say, you know, I haven't heard any word about offshore wind power contracts for Delaware in the elections that are coming up. And I think it'd be great if a lot of people were asking, you know, our elected officials who are being, you know, running campaigns right now, well, are they going to commit to a offshore wind contract for Delaware? That would be a great question to ask, because nobody's been asking them. And, you know, it's like market cost now, if you do the contract right. And there's lots of expertise right at Delaware, you know, in Delaware at the university to help make sure that contract is done right. It's how is the state going to get this goal of 26% reduction in CO2 if we don't do large scale renewable energy? I mean, you can do all kinds of little things, and this is great. We've got a long list of 30 items, and I want us to do all of those 30 items, but we got to do some things that have big effects, and this is one that has a really big effect. So why are we talking about percentage goals and then not implementing some of the big things? And I'll put EVs in that category too, but I don't know how to get, you know, 40%, 50% adoption of EVs. I do know how to build a gigawatt wind farm in a 4-year period. So I just think that should be part of the election discussions. And I'm not an activist really. I like to help people who are trying to do good things, and I'll continue to do that as I'm asked, but I'm not the one who would carry out that kind of a campaign.
All right, we got less than a minute. Thank you again. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Willet, we'll have to bring you back, and once we figure out this time slot thing.
Great.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate your
everybody.
interest.